Before I started riding a motorcycle, nobody warned me about the joys of bug splatter on your visor, especially on those long highway trips. But what if I told you that bugs hitting your visor can actually help you be a safer rider? Stay tuned, and I'll tell you how. Hey everyone, the topic of today's video is collision, and it involves two aspects of my life. The first is as a new motorcycle rider. I'm just finishing my second season and I'm learning to ride safely and enjoy riding a motorcycle. The second is my professional life, where I have been for the past 30 years a researcher and scientist studying the neural control of visual motion detection. I have a research lab, and we do peer-reviewed, published research that focuses on how nervous systems use visual information to avoid collisions. Recently, MCrider put out a video on attention and multitasking and how it relates to motorcycle riding. He clearly did his research, and his video was bang on, basically saying that we actually don't multitask. We're just switching attention from one state to another. I put a link to that video in the description below, and I highly recommend you watch it. It's very educational and very helpful for motorcycle riders. His video inspired me to make this one, inspired me to combine what I know about motion detection and my love of motorcycle riding to help us think about what goes on in our brains as we detect a potential collision and how we might be able to avoid it. So as strange as it may sound, I'm going to borrow from the world of insects and their visual systems to inspire us to think about our own visual systems and how it all relates to collision detection and avoidance. So please bear with me. So how do we know that we're on a collision course with something, or that something is on a collision course with us? What information do we have to tell us that we're about to hit something? Human eyes have a visual field. That visual field is about 180 degrees, going from one side of our head through to the front to the other side of our head. And objects within that visual field occupy some of those 180 degrees. For example, a full moon in the night sky takes up about half of a degree. And that half of a degree is what we call a subtense angle. And for certain objects, the subtense angle will be the same if the object isn't moving. But if the object is getting closer or farther away, that subtense angle is going to change. If it's getting closer, that subtense angle is going to increase. That means the object is going to appear to be bigger in our visual field. And that's one of the main cues that we can use to determine if something is going to collide. Two things have to happen for us to know that something is getting larger in our visual field. The first is what we call detection. That's where photons from the object pass through our eyes onto the photoreceptor cells within the retina on the back of our eyes. Those photoreceptor cells are stimulated. They convert that light information into electrical information that is used for the rest of the nervous system. That electrical information passes along our optic nerve into parts of the brain that are used to make sense out of the images that are coming from the retina. And that second step in the different parts of the brain is what we call perception. So perception is a result of the detection of this growing object on our visual field, and our brain tells us that that object is getting closer. Basically then, we can think of detection as occurring in the eye and perception as occurring in the brain. And each one of those two steps is going to take time. Now, of course, stopping is one of the most important ways to avoid a collision. And those of you who have watched the excellent training videos from channels such as MCrider, MotoJitsu, or Dan the Fireman would have seen this graphic telling us that our stopping distance is a result of our perception time, our reaction time, and our braking distance. And all of those increase the faster we go. What I want to add to this conversation is that perception time, which is estimated to be about 3/4 of a second, is actually a combination of detection time and perception time. Before we can understand what's happening in our brain when it comes to detection and perception, we first have to go back and understand what kind of information is presented to our eyes as we're riding. If we're riding down the road at the same speed as the car in front of us, that car is going to occupy an angle of our visual field. And we use the Greek letter theta in science to refer to that. So when we're far away, theta far is going to be a certain angle represented by the back of the car. If the car were to suddenly stop and we kept going at the speed we were traveling at, then very quickly we would get closer to the car, and that angle theta, now theta near, would be bigger than it was when we were far away. Now here's a very important point to know if we want to understand what kind of information is given to us that tells us we're going to collide. That angle theta, as we move forward, is going to increase. But the point is, it's not going to increase at a constant rate. We can plot theta on a graph where we have a range from 0 degrees, which is infinitely far away, to 180 degrees, which occupies our entire visual field, which essentially means that we're occupying the same space as the object. That means we've collided. That's not good. So we don't want theta to reach 180 degrees. So when that car stops abruptly in front of us and we're heading towards it at a constant speed, its size on our retina is going to increase up until the point where there's actually a collision. When we're far away, theta doesn't change very much. The object doesn't seem to be getting much bigger. However, when we get closer, theta changes more quickly, and suddenly the object is getting bigger very quickly until we actually hit it. So now, let's change gears and look at the world through the eyes of an insect, because insects can give us a lot of information about the detection and the perception of changes in an angle of the field of view when you're moving forward through space and on a collision course. This is the insect I work with in my research. It's a locust from Africa, and over the past 70 years, we have learned a lot about how it uses visual information to avoid collisions. Contrary to what some people might think, locusts do indeed have a brain. Although that brain is barely visible to the naked eye, it does all the kinds of things that our brain does. It has areas that are involved in processing visual information. It has areas used to processing odors. It has areas used to coordinate movement of the legs and wings of the body. And it has areas involved in learning and storage of memories. And it's within those visual areas that there are single cells or neurons that are designed perfectly for detecting collisions. In this experiment, we use a virtual reality type of setup to present a locust with an object that's coming towards it. That black dot in the distance is actually an object that's about 50 meters away in virtual space. At the bottom of this image is a recording of the electrical activity of one single neuron within the locust's visual system that is responsive to objects approaching on a collision course. What you see here is a very brief period of higher electrical activity in that neuron, and we call that period a spike. And that spike can be thought of like a binary code. It's an on or off. And that's the language that the nervous system uses to communicate with the rest of the body. And it's how often those spikes are occurring that gives us information about the kinds of things that are stimulating it. In this case, the object moving towards the locust. What you may have noticed is as the object got closer, those spikes from that neuron were occurring more frequently. And that's the code that this system uses to report an impending collision. So what we have here is a very accurate and precise collision detector. This image demonstrates how we try to understand what that collision detector is actually doing. At the top, you can see a record of all of those spikes as the object is approaching. At the bottom, you see a plot like I showed you before of the size of the object as it gets closer, that visual angle. In the middle, we characterize the response of this neuron, and we measure that by looking at how many of those spikes occur within each second, and we call that the firing rate. The firing rate tells us how this collision detector responds to an object approaching on a collision course. And in this case, that firing rate increases as the object is getting closer. And it reaches a peak at about the time of object collision, when the object stops moving. What we and other researchers have found out is when that firing rate reaches about 175 spikes per second, that triggers an avoidance behavior. And that corresponds to a time when the object passes through about 20 degrees of that visual angle. When the locust is flying, that avoidance behavior is flight steering away from the object that is about to collide with it. This means we have a very tight link between the activity of a collision detector and collision avoidance, and that all hinges around the time when an object passes through 20 degrees of the visual field. So at this point, you're asking yourself, so what? What does an insect brain have to do with me being a safer motorcycle rider? Well, the answer lies in evolution. Studies have shown that this insect collision detector and its responses to objects on a collision course exist in many other kinds of animals, including us. This means that the principles we learn from insects, which are easy to study, can give us a very reasonable scientific insight into what's happening in our own brain, and for the purposes of this video, the brain of a motorcycle rider. Let's go back to our example of riding on the street. Now, if you were paying attention, you would have noticed that that insect collision detector was responding to a fairly small object, only 7 centimeters, and it was moving very slowly at 11 kilometers per hour. When we're riding on the street, we're dealing with higher speeds and larger objects, which means that we have different plots of the visual angle for objects of different sizes traveling at different speeds. And we can look at the time when that object passes through 20 degrees of the visual field. Now, if we were traveling at 100 kilometers per hour and we assume an average car width of about 2 meters, then the plot of the visual angle over time as we get closer looks like this. And we can see that it passes through 20 degrees fairly late in the approach. Now, this doesn't tell us the whole story, of course, because there are other factors involved in collision avoidance, such as experience of riding and knowing to predict certain kinds of situations on the road, and also the quality of your eyes, are they good or bad? But for argument's sake, if we go with the assumption that we're sticking with the single collision detector, then we can compare the times that the object passes through 20 degrees for different speeds and get an idea of when that occurs relative to the time of collision and how much time we might have to react. This plot shows the visual angle of that car for different approach speeds and how the time that it passes through 20 degrees occurs later and later the faster you go. That black line shows the visual angle of your helmet as you're barreling down the highway at 100 kilometers per hour. And that's why that poor little insect isn't able to avoid you. It virtually has no time to react because you pass through 20 degrees almost at the point of collision. So we can look at this in another way. That is, the time you have left to react after the object passes through 20 degrees at different speeds that you're traveling at. So it makes sense that the faster you go, the less time you're going to have to react. And this plot is actually based on scientific data of when an object passes through 20 degrees. And we can see that in this case, only at 30 kilometers per hour or slower do we have more than that 0.75 second reaction time. And look at the time for that poor little insect at the end. It has no time to react. Almost makes you feel sorry for it. So let's go back to our figure on stopping distance and how it involves detection time and perception time. So with practice, we can decrease our reaction time. That is the time for our brain to tell our muscles to squeeze the brake lever. And by using progressive braking, you can decrease that braking distance. Those are things we have control over, and we can gain more control by having more experience. What we cannot control, what we cannot speed up, is that detection time and perception time. We are limited by how fast our brain can process that information, and we can't speed that up. So going slower gives you more time, but we already know that. It's been the subject of many excellent videos on how to ride safely. But what I have hoped to do with this video is give you some insights as to what's happening in your own brain as that car is getting closer, and hopefully give you a bit of an appreciation for what we can learn from our six-legged winged friends. Thank you for watching, and ride safe.